Welcome back. This is Dr. Ben Tafoya with 5 o'clock Macro, doing episode 3 here on April 22nd, 2020. It's very nice to see everyone tonight and having a little problem with the light because it's later than 5 o'clock as I'm recording. But we've been taking a look at GDP over the last couple of parts of our discussion. And we talked last night about the formula for calculating GDP and its component parts, including consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And so tonight I want to continue that discussion and to start off with discussing some of the strengths and weaknesses of GDP as an economic indicator. So the main strength that GDP has is that it's a consistent set of rules, so that we know when we look at GDP figures for 2008 and we compare them to where we are in 2020, the comparisons hold across time periods because we use the same set of rules to calculate GDP in one time period as we do with another. And to some extent, we can compare them across countries. So there are ways that we can account for differences in cost of living and value of currency to calculate GDP so we could compare the US against China or the UK or the European Union as a whole or the Eurozone, whatever. And those kinds of comparisons can also be quite helpful. We'll talk a little bit more in the next couple of sessions about how we do look at economic growth across countries and how we do some of these comparisons. The other strength that we have with GDP is that we get regular releases of data, and we have myriad sources of data to help us understand the current state of the economy. So tonight we're going to look at a couple of those. But the good news is we have an army of economists and statisticians out there providing us data from a wide variety of sources, not just in the US, but around the globe, that keeps us informed as to where we are with the world economy, obviously given some delay for measurement and reporting. And GDP is subject to rigorous examination as well as revision. So in the US, we go through a cycle each quarter of a preliminary estimate, then a second estimate, then a third estimate of GDP for the prior quarter. And tonight we'll talk about when we expect to see that information and what it might tell us about the impact of the current crisis on overall economic activity. Sometimes those revisions are good and help us better understand data. Sometimes they can be a bit problematic. And so here's a story from Reuters in 2010 reporting that the Commerce Department, remember the Bureau of Economic Analysis that publishes these statistics, is part of the Commerce Department of the US government. So in 2010, we figured out, after additional research and evaluation of data, that the Great Recession was actually significantly worse than we had originally anticipated. And GDP in 2009 contracted 2.6%. The original estimate was 2.4%. And in 2008, the downturn was greater than it had been anticipated. And that has a practical impact because policymakers make decisions not just on the politics of what can we get away with here in terms of fiscal policy or monetary policy to help reflate the economy during a recession. But they also make their case based on these economic statistics that we look at And if the statistics are off, then we're not really going to be making the right kinds of decisions. And there were many sharp economists who predicted at the time that the ARRA and associated legislative actions for fiscal policy in 2009 weren't adequate enough to deal with the hole in demand that occurred during the Great Recession. So these numbers that we found a year later would have made that case even stronger at the time. Now, GDP as a measure of economic activity also has some weaknesses that we need to keep in mind. There was several years back a book put together by the Nobel Award-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz called Mismeasuring Our Lives, which talked in detail about these kinds of issues. And it was actually commissioned by the then president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy. No radical he, but he recognized that the concentration of GDP as a measure of economic activity has some flaws in it. Number one is it doesn't account for leisure. So to the extent that a society decides that at the margin they would like to have more leisure time, and there are many countries, particularly in Europe, that have work rules and laws that afford its workers more leisure time than we do in the United States. That improvement in the quality of life by having additional leisure time isn't measured in GDP. And in fact, GDP can discount that because the time we're taking for leisure, we may not be quite as productive. Now, some of our leisure time activities obviously get factored into GDP. We buy a movie ticket, we're purchasing a service. We go to a concert, we're purchasing a service. But when we're sitting at home with our family and other loved ones and friends, that doesn't actually contribute to GDP, but it does contribute to our standard of living. Then one of the other little quirks of this is that when we have a calamity like a hurricane that destroys infrastructure in New York City, causing billions of dollars worth of damage, that loss of infrastructure is not discounted from GDP. But the spending that we incur to rebuild after that kind of an event is actually added into GDP. So if you think about it, the subway's down and it costs us $2 billion to rebuild it. The loss of the subway may have an economic impact in that it lessens other associated economic activity. But the spending on rebuilding it does send money out to households and firms, which gets recirculated into the economy, and that activity is actually measured in GDP. GDP also doesn't measure economic inequality. There are other measures of that, and we'll get to that at some point in our discussion. But when you see the gigantic numbers of economic activity here in the United States, you'll see that simple math shows that there is a great deal of economic inequality in the U.S., more so than most all of the other so-called advanced economies in the world. And GDP doesn't discuss that. It's just a aggregate measure of economic activity. And as such, it's not a measure of quality of life. Quality of life includes all kinds of other factors which GDP doesn't measure. But GDP is a helpful tool for economic policymakers to try to figure out what to do to better manage economic life. The guideposts that we use to make that value judgment as to what will improve economic life, those are political and philosophical decisions that need to be made to inform what it is that decision makers decide. And particularly in a crisis like we're facing now, we see all kinds of human needs that must be met. And frankly, there are no other mechanism beyond direct government spending to meet these kinds of needs. Folks who are having a hard time accessing food, folks who have a hard time accessing medical care, these absences, housing uncertainty, these absences lessen overall quality of life. And we need to recognize that. And many of these factors won't actually be seen by an examination of GDP. We have to take a deeper look at what's going on in society. The other concept that I want folks to understand is that when GDP numbers are published, they're reported two ways. One way is nominal or current dollar GDP, which for the entirety of 2019 was estimated to be $21.4 trillion. Now, let me say, $1 trillion is a very large number that none of us can really conceptualize, but that's the amount of expenditure that we made on production in 2019, measured in the value of the dollar in 2019. So that's why we call it current dollar GDP. That's what we spend in 2019. However, when we think about it for a moment, we recognize that sometimes current dollar GDP can be a bit misleading in that we have inflation over time. So the current dollar in 2019 might be higher than the current dollar was in 2012. And so we need to make adjustments for value that has increased as a result of inflation, a generalized increase in the price level. And we do that using a formula that gives us the real GDP. And so when we take a look at real GDP for 2019, it was $19.1 trillion. So you can see it was significantly less than the current dollar GDP. And that was based on a price index that was chained to the value of the dollar in 2012. So this is what they do when they calculate many of these kinds of economic statistics. They pick a baseline year and they calculate it off of that. At some point in the future, they'll pick a new baseline year. But right now we're working off of 2012. And it does make a significant difference in the gross numbers that we see. But the mechanism they use with the so-called GDP price deflator, so that calculation of inflation, is generalized throughout the various categories. So everything is reduced by that same amount, roughly, in this case 10%, from current dollar GDP to the real GDP number. So we'll resume this discussion when we come back from a break.